All right, in this lesson, we'll discuss how to extract a random sample of either rows or columns from our data frame. Let's begin by re-executing our code. And there we have our first 3 rows of our bond data frame. So let's say I wanted to extract one row at random. What I can do is call the sample method directly on my data frame, just bond.sample. And let's take a look at what happens when we do this method and do not modify any of the parameters. The default is just going to return a single random row from our data frame. Keep in mind that if you're following along on your computer, the movie that you're going to get back or the row that you're going to get back may be different from mine. It's a totally random process. But the sample method by default is just going to give us back one row. Let's click into the parentheses and take a look at some of our available options or parameters. The very first parameter that we have here is called n. And we can actually customize this to specify the number of random rows that we'd like to extract. So for example, if I want to pull 5 random rows, I can do n equals 5. And I'm going to get 5 rows back from the data frame. Keep in mind that these rows are randomly selected one by one, so the order in which they're returned in this data frame that we see here may be a different order than the one that exists in the original data frame. So you can see that Dr. No, which starts with a D and comes fairly early in our regular bond data frame, comes in the 4th position here in our sampled one. So these are just being pulled completely at random. By the way, of course, this sample returns a brand new data frame, so nothing is affected in the original data frame. In addition to n, if we click back in here with Shift-Tab, we can see that we have a parameter called frac, and that's short for fraction. If we don't want to extract a literal number, for example 5, but rather a percentage of the total data frame, let's say we want to pull exactly 25% as a sample. Instead of doing n, we can do frac, and give it a floating point number that's going to represent a percentage. So for example, if I want to pull 25%, I could do 0.25, and that's going to extract 25% or 1 out of every 4 rows for my data frame. The advantage to this approach is it is more adjustable depending on the size of your data frame. If this data frame were longer, like 100 rows, this approach would still get 25% of the rows. N is always going to be literal and concrete and set in stone, but these are just 2 different ways that we can extract a specified number of rows from the data frame, either by a literal number or a percentage of the total rows. Now let's take a look at columns. Let's go back to my n approach, and let's say I want to pull 3. That's going to pull 3 rows by default. If I click back in here and press Shift-Tab, we'll see that we have a familiar axis argument here. And by default, it says none, but none in Pandas terms just means the index axis. So if I do something like axis equals 0, it's going to be the exact same thing, 3 rows. The other alternatives we discussed here were axis equals rows, as well as axis equals index. All of these things are exactly the same. They just extract rows. And predictably, if we wanted to extract random columns instead of random rows, all we have to do is change the argument to this axis parameter. Now we can either change it to 1, which is going to represent the columns in their vertical space. So this is going to extract the entire collection of labels along with 3 random columns. Let's take a look. So in my example, it's extracted the director, the bond actor salary, and the budget. Now if I change this again, I can do something like columns. This is the exact same code as what we just executed. It's just entering that argument as a string instead of a number, which I personally prefer because axis equals columns makes more logical sense to me. But this is once again going to extract 3 random columns from our data frame. In my case, in this example, actor, budget, and director. So if you ever need to extract a random sample and you know either the number you want to extract or the percentage you want to extract, the sample method is the way to go. If you want to modify where you're extracting from, just change the argument to that axis parameter. If you want a specified number, change the argument to the n parameter. And if you want a specific percentage, change the argument to that frac parameter. That is the sample method.